Saturday evening, May 2nd, 1863. After a full day of waiting on the rebels to attack, the Germans of Howard's 11th Corps casually sit back and cook dinner on the extreme right flank of the Union Army. Though there have been some warnings of rebels wandering in the woods, nobody believes they will be attacked at this place or at this time. The woods prove to be a mess to get through, and the sun is setting. Feeling secure, the Germans stack their arms, gather around the campfire, and play some evening music. Just as they're about to begin eating their freshly cooked beef, the Germans start hearing a faint rumble from the west. Given there are thousands of men in the area, they don't give it a second thought. Soon, the rumbling gets louder. Then, critters by the dozens begin pouring out of the woods and run through the camp. Witnessing this odd event, the men turn west to look in the direction the animals are coming from. The second they look, the Germans are mortified by what they see, for as far as they can see is a gray line with red battle flags flying overhead, pouring out of the woods and raising the rebel yell. Instantly, they know what is going on. The Confederacy's great flanker, Stonewall Jackson, is upon them. One of the most demanding, yet fun parts of creating my YouTube videos is reading all the books on the American Civil War. Whether it's about the bloody cornfield at Antietam, the early morning assaults at Stones River, or Stonewall's stunning flank attack at Chancellorsville. If you're just like me and want to learn more every day, you'd also like The Book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization by Hungry Minds. But the book is not just any ordinary piece of historical literature. It's a top Kickstarter project filled to the brim with mankind's greatest inventions and discoveries. Once you flip through its 400 plus pages, you'll discover interesting topics, awe-inspiring illustrations, and rare insights that will drive you to think more deeply. Some of my favorite illustrations include the first animal traps, showing how early humans used the environment to capture wild animals, the evolution of siege engines, and how each machine helped overcome a stubborn enemy's defenses, and finally, how instruments came to be made and how they helped develop a new way of human expression. As I read through the pages, my mind starts to spin with all the creations we as humans have made over the centuries. The best part, as you read through the book, there's a hidden quest for you to discover and complete as you flip through its various chapters. If this sounds like it's right down your alley, the book will be a perfect gift, whether for a friend, a family member, or even for yourself. If you're interested in the book, you can get it for 10% off using my code Warhawk10 after clicking on the link down in the description. Monday, April 27th, 1863, dawns bright and pleasant. The gleeful Germans of Howard's 11th Corps step off from their camps to finally begin Hooker's long-anticipated spring campaign. Once on the road, they are followed by Slocum's 12th Corps and Meade's 5th Corps. To ensure the complete secrecy of the march, they abandon their camp without any ritual music playing or trash burning that usually accompanies a departure. Officers forbid their men from hooping and hollering, limit what they can take, and demand that their soldiers meet a precise marching speed. Explaining their motives, the officers simply said, "They're out to fool Johnny Reb." As the Federals march west, security is kept airtight. Any house on the path has guards placed, roads are constantly patrolled, and locals are crowded into churches. To Hooker, nothing will stop him from surprising Bobby Lee. By the end of the 27th, the Federal flanking column has reached its designated first stop at Hartwood Church. The next day, Tuesday, April 28th, the soldiers file back into line and move out. While the flank column moves, Hooker's left stirs in front of Jackson's 2nd Corps across the Rappahannock. Hoping that the rebels keep their eyes peeled to the east rather than glance west. Continuing the march, the soldiers keep their pace to reach Kelly's Ford by sundown. However, due to Howard's lack of attention, a traffic snare causes the entire column to be delayed and lag behind Hooker's precise timetable. Despite the mishap, Hooker's flanking column is now within striking distance of its first target. While the flanking column is out marching, Sharp is finishing his order of battle for Lee's forces. The colonel has been able to locate and reliably count each brigade in the Southern Army. Thus, Sharp's latest estimates of the rebels place Lee's infantry at approximately 54,000 men, only 2,000 short of Lee's actual count, giving Hooker a near-perfect image of what he will be up against. To add on to the good news, for the first 36 hours, his plan has gone precisely as intended, and the Confederates are still completely in the dark, prompting an astonished Provost Marshal Marcinna Patrick to write, "So far, I think the rebels have not the slightest idea what we are about today. Even the pickets know nothing about it." Now, on Wednesday, April 29th, it's time for Hooker's left to grab hold of Lee's attention. At first light, the men of the 1st and 6th Corps rush to the pontoons and paddle across the Rappahannock, similar to the men of the 2nd Corps back on the first day of the Battle of Fredericksburg. But unlike that earlier battle, the shocked rebels are only able to fire a few shots before retreating. Once the pickets are scattered, the bridges are thrown down to enable more troops across. In no time at all, Hooker's left wing has secured a lodgment on the southern bank of the Rappahannock. As news of the crossing filters back to the main army, Stonewall bids farewell to his wife and child, who depart for safety. Dressed in a brand new uniform, Jackson scans the bridgehead and determines to mass his corps in response. Recognizing that the Federals mean business, Lee approves the massing, calls up his scattered artillery, and sends a message to Richmond to rapidly recall Longstreet. However, due to the suddenness of the crossing, Lee realizes he will most likely have to fight this battle without Longstreet. Thus, Lee's risky bet of splitting his army has utterly failed, dooming his men to face a belligerent foe with double the numbers. To make matters worse for Lee, he receives word that another column is approaching from the west, with an unknown destination. Whatever the case, Lee decides to gather his forces and stay put until he can ascertain the true intentions behind all of Hooker's moving parts. Trying to save face, Lee does his best to inspire his subordinates by saying, "General McLaws, let them know that it is a stern necessity now. It must be victory or death, for defeat would be ruinous." As Lee contemplates his increasingly dire situation, the flanking column, now under Slocum as Hooker departs for his headquarters, begins its crossing of Kelly's Ford. With no rebels guarding, Slocum's men flood across it with ease. Once across, the 3 Corps diverge on multiple roads to hurriedly reach their next target, the Rapidan. While the infantry marches south, it's now time for Stoneman to play his role in Hooker's plan, to wreak havoc in Lee's rear. Stewart, who's at Brandy Station, believes the Federal column is heading west. However, when the Federals do not march in the expected direction, he becomes suspicious. Meanwhile, the diverging Federal Corps rapidly march for the Rapidan. The 11th and 12th Corps easily push back the rebel defenders and take Germanna Ford, using the nearly built rebel bridge to easily cross. Further east, Meade's 5th Corps conquers Eli's Ford without any loss of life and plunges through the rushing water to keep the pace. With the last major barrier out of their way, the 3 Corps now prime to reach their final rallying point in the morning. That night, once he gets word that this unknown column has turned east, Lee pulls back Dick Anderson's division from U.S. Ford to block their apparent path. At daybreak on Thursday, April 30th, Dick Anderson, tasked with blocking the unknown column, determines that the Chancellor's house, in the midst of the wilderness, is not the ideal place to make a stand. He pulls his division back in the direction of Fredericksburg to Tabernacle Courthouse. Stewart, who realizes the Federals are moving towards Lee, rides around the flanking column to rejoin the army. Around the same time, the first elements of the Federal force arrives at Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville, the imposing 2.5-story brick house at the intersection of Eli's Ford Road and the Orange Turnpike, has been a defining part of the Virginia wilderness since its construction by George Chancellor 50 years ago. Now, in the midst of the Civil War, the manor continues to house the Chancellor's extended family, the widow Fanny and 7 of her 9 children, 1 young son and 6 unmarried daughters. With a Confederate station in the vicinity throughout the winter, the chancellors have hosted many parties for the officers in the rebel army, such as Dick Anderson, Billy Mahone, and the dashing Stuart. Now, with Hooker's army on the move, the chancellors have found themselves stuck between two roving armies. When the Federals arrive in the area, they instantly mark the building to be Hooker's new headquarters. Once in Chancellorsville, Meade wants to continue the drive and get out of the wilderness, but he's sorely let down. Slocum informs him that Hooker wants the 2nd and 3rd Corps to join the flanking column before he advances upon Fredericksburg tomorrow. Unable to advance for the remainder of the day, Meade sends out some scouts to reconnoiter the roads they'll be taking. While the Federals march, Lee still remains in the dark about Hooker's true intentions. Unsure what to do, he rides over to his previous command post at Lee's Hill and studies the lodgment along the Rappahannock. After a few minutes, the general has his answer. Completely assured, he announces to his staff, the main attack will come from above. Finding Jackson, Lee informs him of his plans. Move then at dawn tomorrow up to Anderson. With that, Lee is not going to wait around and let Hooker have the first punch. However, to send Jackson west to attack the flanking column, Lee is forced to leave a detachment to man the Rappahannock earthworks. To fill this important role, Jackson taps Major General Jubal Early and 12,400 men to keep the Federal lodgment distracted for as long as possible. Against all military textbooks of the day, Lee decides to split his army in the face of a numerically superior foe. Finding himself between a hammer and an anvil, Lee is risking dividing his army into smaller parts to defeat Hooker's flanking column. Given the grave situation he is in, Lee is willing to fight it out before giving up his Rappahannock line. Upon hearing the news, Jackson readies his men for battle. Rations are cooked, guns are primed, and wagons are sent to the rear. He wants nothing hindering his men when they move out tomorrow morning. With the feeling of a coming battle in the air, a normally calm and composed Stonewall has become animated, which has not gone unnoticed, especially by Colonel William Allen, who wrote, "I well remember the elation of Jackson. He seemed full of life and joy. His whole demeanor was cheerful and lively compared with his usual quiet manner." With everything ready and the day beginning to fade, Stonewall orders the men to be on the road at first light. Meanwhile, at Chancellorsville, Hooker arrives and assumes command of the flanking column to the cheering of his subordinates. Celebrations commence in the halls of the manor as officers and staff toast to their success. An optimistic Brigadier General Alpheus S. William writes about the joyous atmosphere. It was a pleasant, moonlit night. The Chancellorsville house became the center of hundreds of officers. It was a gay and cheerful scene. We had successfully accomplished what we all supposed would be the great work of the campaign. Everybody prophesied a great success, an overwhelming victory. Everybody was full of enthusiastic congratulations. Even the commanding general himself could not contain his excitement. Addressing his men, Hooker said, "It is with heartfelt satisfaction the commanding general announces to the army that the operations of the last 3 days have determined that our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him." Sharing the general's enthusiasm, the men of the Army of the Potomac eagerly bed down for the night, ready to march out of the wilderness and destroy Lee's trapped army. Friday, May 1st, 1863, dawns foggy. As ordered, Jackson's men march out at first light. As they march, the men cheer as they pass Lee, who joins them in their advance. As the gray column nears, Colonel E. Porter Alexander is with Anderson preparing a defensive line. But as he looks back at the arriving Confederate column, he realizes all his work is in vain. Knowing his commanders well, he writes, "Immediately we knew that all our care and preparation at that point was thrown away. We were not going to wait for the enemy to come and attack us in those lines. We are going out on the warpath." Jackson, always looking to go on the offensive, decides that the best way to repulse the enemy is to attack. Once he reaches the defensive line, Stonewall orders them to drop their pickaxes and grab their rifles. Knowing that 2 roads lead to Chancellorsville, Jackson splits his force into 2 columns to proceed down both paths. Anderson, who just came from Chancellorsville, will move back down the Orange Turnpike with 13,000 men, while Jackson, with the remainder of his II Corps, 27,000 strong, will move down the Orange Plank Road. At 10:30 a.m., with the columns organized, Jackson gives the command to advance, despite his II Corps still stretching for miles along the road. Meanwhile, at Chancellorsville, Hooker sends off his men at the same time. For May 1st, Hooker desires to uncover Banks Ford and seize the heights west of Fredericksburg. To do this, he disperses his corps along the various roads. Meade, with 2 of his 5th Corps divisions, some 11,000 men, will advance along the River Road, the northernmost route. Sykes' regulars, some 5,000 men, will march down the Orange Turnpike. Finally, 2 divisions of Slocum's 12th Corps, 13,500 strong, will march down the Orange Plank Road, the southernmost route. While these 3 columns march, Hooker also sends a message to Butterfield to have Sedgwick attack as well. With 4 different pieces moving at once, Hooker hopes to corner and crush rebel army at Fredericksburg. Despite having a near-perfect idea of where all these formations are located, Hooker has no idea that Jackson is aggressively marching his way, as the commanding general still believes he stands massed in front of Sedgwick. This is due to receiving reliable information from Butterfield that reports that Jackson remains in his entrenchments. With that, Hooker sends out his forces, expecting them to face only minor resistance from Anderson's scattered brigades. Thus, as both sides move out, they will be marching blindly towards each other. By noon, the early morning fog is burned off completely to reveal a perfect spring day. With ideal conditions, the cheerful regulars of Burbank's brigade eagerly march forward, leading Sykes' division down the Orange Turnpike. But, as they near Lewis's farmstead, they unexpectedly run headlong into an advancing gray wall of Virginians, who rake their lines. Shocked to see the rebels marching against them, they stutter for a bit before joining the contest. Sykes, seeing his vanguard halting, rushes in both Ayer's regulars and O'Rourke's New Yorkers to deflect the rebel thrust. Sykes' quick thinking stops the Confederates in their tracks and pushes them back. McLaws, seeing Mahone's Virginians struggle, sends in Wofford's and Sims Georgians to extend the rebel line, which overlaps their Federal opponents. As the 2 sides battle, the thick woods fill with smoke, reducing sight to mere feet. Jackson, excited that the battle has finally been joined, encourages his subordinates to push towards Chancellorsville, while Sykes, without any word or sight from the other columns, feels increasingly isolated battling a bloodthirsty foe. In the deep woods of the Virginia wilderness, not one of Hooker's marching columns can see the other. Thus, as Sykes fights for his very existence, both Meade and Slocum push on, despite hearing faint sounds of battle. To make matters worse, Hooker finally receives severely delayed intel reporting that a heavy column is marching his way. This is due to the telegraph line that was set up to connect Hooker with Butterfield malfunctioning. Now, almost 4 hours after the information was sent, Hooker realizes he's not just facing a stubborn rearguard, but the majority of Lee's army. Knowing that Sykes' division is too small to contend with Jackson, and the other columns are nowhere close to support, the general is not confident his men can hold in the narrow wooded roads. Therefore, at 2 p.m., instead of continuing the advance, Hooker decides to halt and recall his men in the face of this unexpected rebel onslaught. Caught on the back foot, the general orders his men back to Chancellorsville to take up defensive positions, hoping this would entice the offensive-minded rebels to press on and throw themselves against this new line. Despite the sound reasoning based on the available information, Hooker's subordinates are angry with the recall, as they believe they could have held their ground. Nevertheless, Sykes, facing an enemy who's growing larger by the minute, hurriedly pulls his men back when he gets word of the withdrawal. Smelling blood, Jackson orders his men to advance on every front. On the turnpike, Sykes' regulars are having a difficult time retreating and suffer immensely in the withdrawal. Once they near Chancellorsville, the regulars about face and blast the onrushing rebels, stopping them in their tracks. Meanwhile, on the Orange Plank Road, Jackson sends Ramser's North Carolinians nipping at the heels of the retreating 12th Corps. These Tar Heels chased the Federals so far down the road that Colonel Alexander wrote, "They could see the Chancellor House and the black masses of the troops about it." Seeing the Federals build up in front of him, Jackson decides on a flank attack to crack their line. With Wright's Georgians nearby, Jackson sends them on a flanking movement to the left as light begins to fade. Passing by the Catherine Furnace, the Georgians approach the Hazel Grove clearing, the highest ground in the area. But as they near, they are riddled by shot and shell from the XII Corps, who's occupying the hill. Seeing the Georgians waver in the storm of lead, Jackson rides over to recall them, where he's almost hit by a shell. With daylight all but gone, the two sides pull back out of range, fully expecting the battle to recommence in the morning. Once the firing has ceased, the Federal soldiers begin hacking away at the dirt and timber as orders have come down from Army Command to build fortifications. Hooker wants his defensive lines enhanced to ensure that when the rebels do attack, they will pay dearly for every inch of ground. Despite not achieving his goals for May 1st, Hooker assures his subordinates that his plan is still working. First, he has succeeded in maneuvering the army into a good position south of the Rappahannock. And second, he has successfully baited Lee out of his Fredericksburg entrenchments. Now, with 5 corps massed at Chancellorsville, his men constructing earthworks, and Lee on the offensive, Hooker can sit back and let the rebels bash their heads against his reinforced lines. Informing General Couch, his second in command, he says, "I have got Lee just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground." Meanwhile, as the exhausted rebel infantry rests in the woods just east of Chancellorsville, Lee and Jackson meet at the intersection of the Orange Plank and Catherine Furnace roads to discuss tomorrow's plan. Though they haven't driven Hooker into the river yet, Lee has won something more desirable: the initiative. Thanks to Jackson's aggressive attacks and Hooker's intention to fight a defensive battle, Lee's free to make the next move, a position the old general likes to be in. Once it is apparent that Hooker is inviting him to attack, Lee dutifully accepts his invitation. Before any plan can be formulated, scouting parties are sent out to reconnoiter the Federal lines for any weakness they can exploit. Anchored on the Rappahannock, the Federal left is too securely positioned to be broken. However, on the other flank, the Confederates find potential. While scouting the woods, Stuart's roving cavalry units find the Federal right hanging in the air. Better yet, while on the prowl, Stuart is surprised by the apparent lack of Federal horsemen protecting Hooker's flanks. Considering Hooker's dispositions, Lee decides that is where he will attack. With this information in hand, Lee calls on Reverend Beverly Tucker Lacey, Jackson's chaplain general and local of the wilderness. Informing him on the area, Lacey tells Lee that infantry marching by the way of the Catherine Furnace can not only swing around the Federal right, but also get behind them as well. Thoroughly convinced of its merits, Lee and Jackson agree that is where they'll strike. Yet, due to the lateness of the hour, specific details will have to wait till the morning. Once the meeting ends, Jackson rises, salutes Lee, and says, "My troops will move out at 4 o'clock. With no tents on hand, the generals and their staff make a simple bivouac at the intersection, using nothing but their coats and saddles as bedding. In the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, May 2nd, 1863, Jackson rises early to determine the route he'll take on his flanking march. Yet, when Lacey informs Stonewall of the proposed path, Jackson is worried his men will be spotted. Wanting to find a more secure route, Jackson sends out Reverend Lacey and Jedediah Hotchkiss, his map maker, to scout the roads ahead. During their early morning ride, they learn from the owner of the Catherine Furnace, Charles C. Welford, that there's a byway that can completely avoid Federal pickets. Once they return to camp and inform Jackson, he is pleased. Once the plan is set, Jackson meets with Lee at his campfire to confer his ideas. Lee greets him by saying, "Well, General Jackson, what do you propose to do?" Stonewall shows Lee the map and moves his finger along the path he'll be taking, saying, "I propose to go right around here." Lee asks in return, "What do you propose to do it with?" Jackson answers, "My whole command." Intrigued, Lee asks, "What will you leave me here to hold the Federal Army with?" Jackson again answers, "The 2 divisions that you have here." Considering the plan, Lee finally says, "Well, go ahead." Once the conversation ends, Jackson rises, salutes his general, and says, "My troops will move out at once, sir." Meanwhile, across the woods at Chancellorsville, the Federals stay busy preparing their defensive lines. Rifle pits are dug, trees are cut down, and abattis are placed. To Hooker, he wants to refight the Battle of Fredericksburg, but this time with the rebels throwing themselves against entrenched fortifications. The line he is forming is roughly 6 miles long, convex in shape, and its left rests securely on the Rappahannock River. Holding the left is Meade's 5th Corps, which runs along the Mineral Spring Road. To the right of Meade are 2 divisions of Couch's 2nd Corps, forming the left end of the salient that encompasses Chancellorsville. On the right end of the salient and at Hazel Grove sits Slocum's 12th Corps. Behind the Chancellorsville house are 2 divisions of Sickles' 3rd Corps, sitting in reserve. On the far right flank sits Howard's 11th Corps. Hooker, not confident with Howard or his Germans, has placed them on the far right of the army, as far away from combat as possible. To make matters worse, Howard's right flank is left hanging in the air. To correct this, the general has called for Reynolds to come from Fredericksburg and extend his right, but he will not be up until nightfall. Until Reynolds arrives, Howard will be alone to hold the flank. All told, Hooker has over 72,000 men and 184 guns along his lines, already outnumber the forces Lee has broken off from Fredericksburg. When the fortifications are added into the mix, Hooker believes Lee has absolutely no chance of breaking through his lines. After reviewing the rest of his line, Hooker finishes his trip at Howard's 11th Corps and is astonished by the poor placement of his units. Similarly aghast, Hooker's engineers beseech the general to fix the gaps in his lines. Howard points to the trees and says, "The forest is thick and tangled. Will anybody come through there?" Hooker's chief engineer Cyrus Comstock replies, "Oh, they may." To cap off Howard's appalling arrangement, the Corps commander has only bent back a few regiments to protect his flank. Whatever the case, Howard believes he is too far from the rebels to be attacked and did not seriously bother to build adequate defenses. While Hooker frets over his apathetic Corps commander, Jackson quietly readies his men for the flanking march. The force Jackson has taken with him on the march is the 3 divisions he still has on hand after leaving early in Fredericksburg. Those are the divisions of A.P. Hill, Colston, and Rhodes, which totals 15 brigades, 27 batteries, and 33,000 men. The force staying with Lee to hold Hooker in place is the divisions of Dick Anderson and McLaws, numbering 15,000 strong. For the second time in 24 hours, Lee's dividing his army again in the face of a superior foe, ignoring all conventional military tactics of the day. To make sure the Federals are fixated on Lee, an artillery bombardment is ordered to distract them. Yet this did little to scare the Federals and actually impedes Stonewall's march until after sunrise due to counter-battery fire. Finally, at 7 a.m., after many delays, Colquitt's Georgians, leading Rhodes' division, steps off. Following Rhodes is Colston's division, with Hill's light division pulling up the rear. To ensure nothing hinders the movement, only the fighting trains are brought along, such as the ammunition wagons and ambulances. Guiding this march is Charles B. Welford, the son of the owner of the Catherine Furnace. To keep the march a secret, Jackson forbids music, calls, and cheering from his troops. Along with that, he continuously tells his men to press on and that straggling will not be tolerated. Regardless of the semi-early start, Hill's division does not move out until 11 a.m., 4 hours after Rhodes' men step off. Luckily for Jackson's foot cavalry, the day is pleasant and breezy, and the roads are damp, preventing dust clouds from forming. Writing about the march, Catherine Harrison Griffith of the 14th South Carolina recalls, "For hours our silent column swept along the roads at the quick step, now turning to the right and now to the left." Despite hoping to keep his march a secret, Jackson's men are spotted near the furnace by some Federal lookouts in the trees at 8 a.m. But it will not be until 10 a.m. when Sickles acts on the reports. After getting confirmation from Hooker, Sickles bombards the rebel column, which skedaddles out of view. Hooker, Where are the rebels moving to his right? Cautions Howard. We have good reason to suppose that the enemy is moving to our right. Please advance your pickets for purposes of observation as far as may be safe in order to obtain timely information of their approach. When Howard receives Hooker's message, he doesn't buy the seriousness and still insists that the Tangled Woods will protect him. However, unlike Howard, Major General Carl Schurz suspects that they are in grave danger. Nonetheless, Howard does little to heed Hooker's warning and does not reposition his units. While Stonewall is out marching in the woods, both commanders look east towards Fredericksburg to make some moves there. Hooker orders Sedgwick to make an attack if possible, yet the cautious-minded Sedgwick deems the attack unwise and therefore declines. On the other side of the stalemate, Lee requests that Early send some of his men if the Federals are weakening their lodgment, but when his orders arrive, they are misconstrued to the point that Lee's request turns into an order. Thus, instead of sending a portion of his men, Early withdraws with 4 of his brigades, only leaving Hayes' brigade of Louisiana Tigers to hold back Sedgwick's entire corps. Soon, Sedgwick learns of the withdrawal but does not believe the reports, opting to remain on the defensive. Back at Chancellorsville, the one man who is chafing for a fight is Sickles, who has been petitioning Hooker to attack the unknown rebel column that appears to be retreating. Finally, at 1 p.m., an annoyed Hooker gives Sickles a go-ahead but cautions his general to move carefully. Sickles, with the green light, sends out Birney's division to harass the Confederates, but as they come upon the furnace, they only find the 23rd Georgia, which has been detached to protect Jackson's rear. Seeing an entire division march his way, Colonel Emory F. Best pulls his Georgians back to the nearby unfinished railroad. But the ensuing fight does not last long, as Best realizes he is largely outgunned and surrenders. Because there was no fighting since the early morning artillery duel, this small fight at the Catherine Furnace unintentionally becomes a magnet, pulling more troops in from both sides. Lee, watching the Federals advance on his left, orders Anderson to extend his line west closer to the furnace, while Hill, receiving reports of Best's Georgians under attack, detaches brigades of Archer and Thomas to lend support. Sickles, who has lost control of the advance, calls on the divisions of Whipple and Williams to reinforce his exposed position. In the broken terrain around the furnace, neither side tries to press their advantage, preferring to hunker down in the thick underbrush and take pot shots. Though the entire regiment is captured, Sickles fails to do any more damage to Stonewall's rear, which disappears into the woods. Watching Jackson's column march south, Sickles believes this is an obvious sign of an enemy in retreat and forwards this news to Hooker. Following the fight, the Georgians begin laughing as they are herded back to Chancellorsville. When one of the Federals asks them what is so funny, one of them responds, "You may think you have done a big thing just now, but wait till Jackson gets around on your right." Just after 3 p.m., after marching for 12 hours through the dense Virginia wilderness, Jackson arrives on the flank of the Federal Army. Once there, he begins forming up his flanking column into lines of battle. As the soldiers move into position, Jackson reports to Lee, "I hope to attack as soon as practicable. I trust that an ever-kind Providence will bless us with great success." Since he's within half a mile of the enemy, this has to be done in complete silence. No shouts, no calls, only hand gestures. The first to deploy is the lead unit, Rhodes, who straddles his division on the Orange Turnpike. After Rhodes, Colson forms a second line, then Hill arrives to form the third line to cap off the formation. While the infantry forms, the artillery deploys on the road, as that is the only place where they have enough room to operate. Given all this maneuvering is being done in the deep woods, it's painfully slow. Altogether, Jackson has formed his detachment into a column of divisions, with each division stacked on the other 200 yards apart. With not much of the day remaining, Jackson instructs his officers of their objective. Using the turnpike as a guide, they will advance east upon the unsuspecting enemy, with Dowdall's Tavern as their target. To convey the importance of capturing the tavern, Jackson demands that it must be carried at all hazards. emphasizing that there will be no pausing under any circumstances. Any brigade unable to push forward will be immediately replaced by trailing formations. To Jackson, failure is not an option. Despite their best efforts to stay quiet while forming on the flank of the enemy, Federal pickets start hearing, seeing, and engaging Jackson's men in the woods beyond the Federal right. Colonel Leopold von Gilza, in command of a brigade of New Yorkers at the end of the army, brings multiple reports to his superiors, only to be laughed out of the room. With no orders to change front, von Gilza can do little more than return to his line. To Howard, an enemy reported to be retreating is not massing for an attack. This is due to Hooker receiving credible evidence from Sickles that Lee is, in fact, retreating south. The commanding general believes his ultimate plan has finally come to fruition. Lee has been uprooted from his Rappahannock line and is now fleeing rapidly south towards Richmond. At 5:30 p.m., once all is ready, Jackson gives Rhodes the go-ahead. The men in the first line step off and quickly advance through the matted vines and tangled underbrush. As the rebels move forward, they drive various critters, such as quail, deer, and rabbits, before them into the Federal flank. Letting out their infamous blood-curdling yell, the Confederates charge out of the woods and into the unsuspecting Federal ranks. The Germans, casually cooking dinner, have no time to form a coherent line. Those who try to withstand the attack are gunned down in mere moments, while the ones still alive flee in abject terror. In a matter of minutes, von Gilza's entire brigade crumbles. Luther Mesner of the 55th Ohio wrote of the chaotic scene. To the right or left or in front as far as I could see, everything was fleeing in panic. It seemed to me that the whole army has gone to pieces. Following the Flying Dutchman, Stonewall's men come upon the Wilderness Church. At the church stands Battery I, the 1st Ohio Light Artillery, commanded by Captain Hubert Leatherbreeches Dilger, which, for a time being, holds back the rebel wave alone. For his daring effort, Dilger will be awarded the Medal of Honor in 1893, 30 years after the battle. Dilger holds back Rhodes' men just long enough for a shocked Howard to build a patchwork line at the tavern. Yet, a single battery is not strong enough to hold back an entire division, and soon the floodgates burst open. Colson's men, replacing Rhodes, slam into Bushbeck's line and smash it into pieces, sending his men running in all directions. For unknown circumstances, Hooker does not learn about Howard's destruction until the Germans start running past the Chancellor's house. Seeing this wave of humanity fly by, Hooker exclaims, "My God, here they come!" With a crisis building on his right flank, Hooker leaps into action in the fading twilight. The general scrambles together a force to blunt Jackson's onslaught, which ironically includes his old division, the 2nd Division in Sickles' 3rd Corps, now led by Major General Hiram Berry. Encouraging his former soldiers, Hooker calls out, "Receive them on your bayonets! Don't fire a shot! They can't see you!" With this counterattack, Hooker manages to stall Colson's assault, which has broken down in the chaotic woods. To ensure his men will hold, the fear that has infected the 11th Corps must be squashed. Any Flying Dutchman who refuses to stand tall is shot down. Soon, some resemblance of the 11th Corps is brought back, and the shattered unit is moved to safety. Hooker then calls on other units to form a bulwark against Jackson. Sickles is recalled from the Catherine Furnace. Slocum reoccupies his position guarding Fairview, and Reynolds is ordered to quicken his pace to the front. At the same time, Hooker also calls on some cavalry to help corral the fugitives. Yet, after riding a little too close to the front, the 8th Pennsylvania finds himself isolated and decides to charge the attacking rebel infantry to break out. In a matter of moments, almost 100 Keystone Staters are gunned down in their suicidal charge. Despite this minor encounter, word soon spreads among the gray ranks to watch out for roving Federal cavalrymen. Though exhausted, Stonewall's victorious men couldn't contain their excitement. Over 2 hours since Jackson unleashed his men upon the exposed Federal right, his attack has been a smashing success. Howard's entire 11th Corps has been shattered, and Dowdall's Tavern is taken. Thousands of prisoners and a dozen guns have been captured. Writing to his brother, Robert Garnett of the 21st Virginia proudly said, "You never saw such a charge as we made upon them. We soon got them routed, and then it was a perfect foot race." By now, around 8 p.m., the fading twilight has disappeared completely. But luckily for Jackson, a bright moon casting a reddish glow in the smoke has taken its place. giving enough light for the aggressive general to press his advantage. Though they can see in the clearings that dot the wilderness, visibility becomes fleeting the deeper they go into the woods. Undeterred whatsoever, Jackson calls up Hill's freshmen to replace Colson's disorganized line. Though these men have not seen combat that day, the prospect of making a nighttime assault even makes a veteran soldier anxious. Before Jackson sends in Hill's men, the two officers ride together with their staff past the front line to reconnoiter the ground the men will cross. Major Pendleton, Jackson's aide, worries that the general is needlessly exposing himself to danger. Jackson scoffs and says, "The danger is over, the enemy is routed." However, unbeknownst to Lane's North Carolinians, they have no idea that either officer has ridden ahead of their line. Thus, when they hear horses walking off in the darkness, Lane's skittish men believe they are being attacked by cavalry and fire multiple volleys. Men and horses drop, causing panic among the group, who scatter to avoid the flying lead. Hill jumps off his horse and calls the soldiers to stop firing. Lane's Tar Heels suspect the calls for a ceasefire to be a Yankee trick and continue the fire into the darkness. But after a few moments, Hill finally manages to get them to stop. Once it's safe to return to the scene, Hill finds Jackson shot 3 times, once in the right hand and 2 in the left arm. Finding themselves in no man's land between the lines, Jackson's staff quickly rushes him off the field in the midst of a Federal bombardment. But in their hurry to get off the field, these men drop the wounded Stonewall multiple times, causing the general to groan incessantly. After traveling half a mile down the turnpike, the party finds Dr. Hunter McGuire, Jackson's chief surgeon, who takes the general into his care. With Jackson incapacitated, Hill assumes command of the II Corps. To make things worse, the volley fired by Lane's men sparks a reaction from the opposing Federal artillery, who fired down the length of the turnpike. During the bombardment, Hill is struck in the leg by shrapnel. Unable to walk or ride, Hill is forced to turn over command only minutes after assuming it from Jackson. Hill first wants to give the command of the II Corps to Rhodes, but opts to turn over to Jeb Stuart, the only other major general on the field. Because Stuart is off watch in the Rapidan, it'll be some time before he arrives. Therefore, with no effective commander on the field, Jackson's great flank attack comes to a close. As Jackson's II Corps runs out of steam, another general decides to launch a nighttime attack as well. Sickles, who is worried about being cut off from Hooker, sends Birney's division north to flush the rebels out of the woods. At 11 p.m., Birney's division, with Ward's New Englanders leading, charges with bayonets against Hill's line. Soon, however, Sickles' thrust evolves into a chaotic nighttime shootout with a hidden enemy, who can only be seen by their muzzle flashes. Even worse, the soldiers in Williams' division of the 12th Corps unknowingly begin shooting into the backs of their own men. Realizing nothing useful can be done, Birney pulls back his men to Hazel Grove, with little to show for their effort. Despite the near-mortal blow the Army of the Potomac took, Hooker is determined to salvage his campaign. First, the commanding general sends the second order to Sedgwick, this time ordering the timid general to carry the thinly held heights behind the town and march west to fall upon Lee's exposed rear. Yet, until Sedgwick can reach Chancellorsville, Hooker's new line must hold in the face of renewed rebel aggression. Once the order is sent, Hooker gets to work organizing his lines for the next day's fighting. With Reynolds finally on the field, the 1st Corps is deployed along Hunting Run to block any future flank attacks. Meade, who was not engaged that day, is shifted west to face Jackson on Elias Ford Road. Howard is ordered to pull together whatever forces he has left and garrison Meade's former line. Sickles and Slocum, who check Stonewall's ferocious attack, are ordered to dig new earthworks where they stand. Altogether, the 2nd, 3rd, and 12th Corps are forming a more compact salient around Chancellorsville. Once in place, the soldiers work feverishly throughout the night constructing new earthworks. Once his lines are set, Hooker adamantly announces to his officers, these lines must be held at all hazards. On the other side of the field, just after midnight on Sunday, May 3rd, 1863, Lee finally receives the shocking news of Jackson's wounding. Though surprised by the news, Lee responds by saying, "Thank God it is not worse. God be praised that he's yet alive." Regardless, with Hooker still on the field, Lee has to make preparations for the next day. With the army now split in two, Lee's main priority is to unite the two halves. Riding to Stuart, the general stresses to work by the right wing, turn the positions of the enemy, to drive him from Chancellorsville, which will again unite us. Everything will be done on this side to accomplish the same object. Whatever happens today, Lee's outnumbered men must be the first to strike. They must press the attack, not only to connect the divided forces, but also keep Hooker on the defensive. Lee, ever the gambler, is betting that a smaller force can not only crack Hooker's salient, but also break his will to fight as well. A tactic that worked well against McClellan during the 7 Days battles. Because, if on the contrary, Hooker ever decides to go on the offensive, it could spell the end of the army in Northern Virginia. Coincidentally, Hooker's considering abandoning the very spot Lee wants to attack first. The III Corps, the main unit separating the two halves of the Confederate army, protrudes out upon Hazel Grove. Though it blocks Lee from connecting his lines, it also allows the rebels to attack Sickles on both sides. Seeing the danger, Hooker opts to pull the III Corps closer in. But just as Sickles begins his evacuation as the first light appears, rebel yells can be heard off in the woods. Hill's Light Division, now in the command of Brigadier General Henry Heath, at the orders of Stuart, renews the battle at 5:30 a.m. Archer's Lone Tennessee Brigade, on the extreme right, quickly drives off the remaining units atop Hazel Grove, but then comes upon stiffer resistance from Ross's New Yorkers. To Archer's left, McGowan's South Carolinians make their attack but suffer greatly, losing multiple commanders in succession. Lane's vengeful North Carolinians, shouting "Remember Jackson," storm over the first rings of earthworks, while Pender's Tar Heels carve a bloody path through the III Corps, killing Major General Hiram Berry and capturing Hayes in their advance. But unlike the rest, Thomas's Georgians did not see the same success, as they were stopped cold by accurate Federal fire. While Heath is throwing his men against the Federal line, Alexander, recognizing the tactical advantage of Hazel Grove, begins jamming as many guns atop it as possible. After about 30 minutes, the artillery chief accumulates nearly 50 guns from 12 different batteries, allowing him to rake any Federal position all the way to the Chancellor's house. Once Alexander's guns open up, they pummel the helpless Yankee infantry, who can do little but take the pounding. The Federal artillerymen try their best to respond, but suffer greatly at the hands of the converging fire. Seeing the artillery utterly dominate the scene, Major Willie Pegram exclaims at Alexander, "A glorious day, Colonel, a glorious day." As chaos shakes up Berry's division, Thomas and his Georgians penetrate a gap in the Federal line, using it to get near the Chancellor's house. Hooker, seeing these rebels closing in, orders Carroll's Westerners to about-face and counterattack. Carroll's attack is so sudden that it not only drives Thomas back, but it also routs the northern half of Heath's spent division. Yet, Carroll's men can only go so far and are forced to turn back after the storm of lead is too much to take. Seeing Heath run out of steam, Stuart orders up Colson's men, who, despite the urgency of the battle, are slow to move up. Colson's brigades, filling the holes left by Heath's men, take the fight to the Federals. Nichols, filling the gap left by Thomas, has his left foot severed by a Federal shell. Williams, now in the command of Warren's North Carolina Brigade, grapples with Ruger's stubborn men along their barricade. In this fight, the Tar Heels see the third change in command of the brigade in just 24 hours, with Williams going down. Hoping his veterans will break the Yankee line, Colson sends forward Paxton's and Garnett's Virginians against the center. Though hoping for the best, both Paxton and Garnett are gunned down, and their men scramble for the rear. To the south, Lee's two divisions begin their assault against the southern end of the salient. Dick Anderson, on the left flank, pivots his brigades towards Hazel Grove to link up with the II Corps, while McClaw sends his men straight ahead into the Federal line. But unlike their comrades to the west, these brigades have the misfortune of attacking veteran troops behind stout entrenchments. Though worried about the increasingly desperate situation on the right, Couch's men riddle the attacking Confederates to their front. The only saving grace for these rebels is that their attacks are tying down these men from turning to face Stuart. Now, by 8:30, almost 3 hours since the fighting has rekindled, the Blue Line, thanks to the earthworks, have not only held, but pushed back the Confederates' desperate attempts to crack the Chancellorsville salient. However, after fighting close to 3 days straight, many units, infantry and artillery alike, have started running out of ammunition, to the point that whole formations march off the field once their rounds are exhausted, such as Brigadier General Joseph Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, who orders the men to withdraw without explicit orders. Those who decide to stay fix bayonets and desperately search for rounds among their dead and wounded. All the while, Stuart is throwing more weight into the contest. Thus, as Federal firepower starts to slacken, Confederate firepower grows in strength. Following the repulse of the Virginians, Stuart sends in Rhodes, his last remaining division, in an all-out attack. As Rhodes' men go into the attack, Stuart rides around the Gray Line singing, "Oh Joe Hooker, when you come out of the wilderness," to inspire his men. Iverson's North Carolinians and O'Neill's Alabamians push through the carnage and reach the inner earthworks being held by Whipple's 3rd Division. In the midst of the struggle, O'Neill slumps down due to shrapnel, while south of the turnpike, Dole's Georgians and Ramser's North Carolinians renew the fight against Birney's 1st Division. 25-year-old Brigadier General Stephen D. Ramser, one of the youngest and newest brigadiers in Lee's army, is looking to make a name for himself. Yet, as he nears the front, he finds remnants of Garnett's brigade blocking his path. Not wanting to waste time, Ramser shouts to his men, "Forward, boys, walk right over them." Leading his Tar Heels over the demoralized Virginians, Ramser charges right into Graham's defending Pennsylvanians, who skedaddle at the sight of the bayonet. Though he was victorious, the cost of victory wasn't cheap. Over 50% of his brigade was shot down, with the 4th North Carolina losing 79% of its men, one of the highest of any regiment in the war. The flight of Graham's Pennsylvanians created a large hole in the Chancellorsville salient, a hole that now threatens the Federal battery at Fairview. Seeing the Confederates spill through, more and more Federal units start fleeing north towards U.S. Ford. Sickles, watching the crisis grow, sends an urgent request to Hooker for reinforcements. At 9:15, when his courier arrives at the Chancellor's house, the very pole that Hooker is leaning on is struck by a Confederate shell. This causes the commanding general to be violently knocked out. Seeing Hooker collapse, many terrified soldiers run away, shouting that Fighting Joe Hooker has been killed. Unbeknownst to his subordinates, Hooker has suffered a severe concussion, which causes him to go in and out of consciousness. Fearing the worst, Hooker is moved to the Bullock House to get away from the fighting. Couch, who is the senior ranking general on the field after Hooker, is briefly called over but never asked to assume command. Despite his lapses in consciousness, Hooker insists he's well enough to command and refuses to turn it over. Therefore, as the battle reaches its climax with the breach of the salient, the Army of the Potomac will be without its commander at the very moment he is needed most. One of the last orders Hooker issued before his injury was for Gary to hold his position at all hazards. Now, with his men being hit on the front and flank, Gary decides he has fulfilled the requirements of the order and retreats north. William Augenbaugh, a private in the 5th Ohio, writes about this desperate situation. "It appeared as though we were completely surrounded, with the enemy's missiles coming from every direction. With Stuart and Lee driving their men against the flanks and Alexander raking the whole area, the pressure is becoming unbearable for the defenders of Chancellorsville. Meade, seeing the Federals on the verge of breaking, sends in Tyler's 9-monthers to stop a flank attack by Colquitt's Georgians, Stuart's final reserve. These Pennsylvanians are able to blunt the Confederates' push further north, impressing even the doubtful Meade. Yet, in the center, the Federal battery at Fairview begins to falter as its infantry support runs away. Unable to stymie the rebel advance with canister, the only other option these gunners have left is a withdrawal. The gunners operate their pieces until the butternut-clad infantry are nearly on top of them, letting off one more blast before joining the retreat north to the new Federal line. At 10 a.m., hearing that Fairview has fallen, Lee rides over the Hazel Grove to observe the battle, marking the official reunification of the Army after 24 long bloody hours. Meade, watching as rebel infantry moves across his front, realizes he has a perfect chance to launch a devastating flank attack to save the failing salient. But as he sends his request for the attack to Hooker, he is denied. Instead, the day's commander orders Couch to begin extracting the army from its crumbling position. Couch orders remaining units in the Chancellorsville salient to retreat north to the Bullock House line. Seeing the final Federal units flee, the bloodied rebel infantry falls hard on their heels. Stuart, falling behind his victorious infantry, shouts, "Go forward, boys, we have them running, and we'll keep them at it." With the Yankee infantry breaking for the rear, Alexander moves up half his guns to Fairview to pummel the final units defending Chancellorsville. However, these units are positioned so close to the house that it receives a few stray rounds. Soon, the building catches fire, and all the wounded who are put in there are quickly evacuated. As the Chancellor's house burns, the final Federal guns try their best to keep the rebels at bay, but their efforts are in vain. Once the Federal gunners are dealt with, the bone-tired rebel infantry captures the burning building and begin looting the abandoned tents. When Lee receives word of the capture of Chancellorsville, he slowly makes his way to inspect the front line. As he rides, his exhausted men line the road around him and give off rousing cheers to celebrate this momentous triumph. Some 40 hours ago, Lee decided to attempt one of the most daring moves of the war. Now, after nearly 18 hours of marching and fighting in the dense woods of the Virginia wilderness, Lee's men stand on the cusp of pushing the Federals across the Rappahannock. With Hooker's men finally routed and apparently on the run for the U.S. Ford, Lee starts gathering up his men to attack the Federal rearguard holding the Bullock House line. However, just as the general is planning on pressing his advantage, worrying news arrives from the east. Fredericksburg has fallen. While Lee and Stuart are sending wave after wave of Confederates against the Chancellorsville salient, Sedgwick finally decides to attack the severely weakened rebel lines holding Fredericksburg. Though he was repulsed twice while trying to attack the infamous Stonewall, the third attack successfully carries the position and captures loads of rebel defenders. Now, with nobody standing in his way, an uncomfortable Sedgwick sends his men west through enemy territory, looking to attack Lee's distracted men in the rear. When Lee receives this news, he cancels his planned attack against the Bullock House line and quickly orders McClaw's division to march east to block Sedgwick's approach. But before either of these two marching columns can make contact, an aspiring brigadier general, Alabamian Camus M. Wilcox, determines to be the one to stop Sedgwick in his tracks. At Salem Church, halfway to Chancellorsville, Wilcox makes a stand. Supported by the arriving brigades under McClaw's, the Alabamian holds firm in the face of a fierce bombardment. The Federal infantry then tries to break through, but meets stiff resistance and breaks for the rear. Sedgwick, already worried the hell about being alone in Confederate territory, decides to end his attempt to support Hooker. Lee, thoroughly convinced that Hooker is a defeated man, decides to pivot his men to annihilate Sedgwick instead. At 7 p.m. that night, while Stuart remains at Chancellorsville to watch Hooker, Lee issues orders for his other subordinates to get their troops into position to attack Sedgwick in the morning. By the time the sun finally sets, May 3rd has proven to be one of the bloodiest days of the war thus far. Starting with the bloodletting that was Chancellorsville, to the Federal capture of Marie's Heights, and to the final clash at Salem Church. Lee and Hooker and their subordinates have battled throughout the Fredericksburg area along the Rappahannock from sunup to sundown. In the end, May 3rd has ended with a massive casualty list, with a combined total of 21,357 men killed, wounded, and missing, a number that only ends up just behind Antietam as the second most bloodiest day in American history. In the very early morning hours of Monday, May 4th, 1863, Lee orders a bombardment to keep the Federals on their toes. At 3 a.m., Major Robert A. Hardaway launches his surprise bombardment, scaring the sleeping Federals wide awake. The rebel prisoners captured during the previous day's battle are delighted at the scene and let off wild yells. Though not much physical damage is done, the psychological damage is immense, causing many in Hooker's headquarters to believe that their position at the Bullock House line is untenable. At the same time, the rebel prisoners eagerly inform them that Longstreet and his 2 belated divisions are at Gordonsville and are rapidly marching to reinforce Lee. Despite the lack of any actual evidence, Hooker has speculated by this day there's a good chance Longstreet can reach the Rappahannock. To ensure they have up-to-date information on Longstreet's whereabouts, Butterfield contacts Peck, who informs the Chief of Staff that Longstreet has departed the Tidewater on May 3rd. Nevertheless, with Longstreet on the move north, Hooker and his officers continue to anxiously scan the horizon in all directions for his soon-to-be arrival. Meanwhile, Sedgwick, still a bundle of nerves, worries about his next move. With the rebels blocking his front and reports of rebels now in his rear, he realizes that he's thoroughly isolated in enemy country. Unwilling to press forward to fall back, Sedgwick opts to form a salient around his only open crossing of the Rappahannock, Banks Ford. To make things worse for Uncle John, Fighting Joe Hooker's shown signs of his old self again after his injury. After studying his and the enemy's dispositions, Hooker decides to go back on the offensive, but this time cross over to the north bank and then march east to link up with Sedgwick at his Banks Ford salient. Hooker's not the only one looking to make moves on this Monday. Lee, seeing a chance to trap Sedgwick and sweep him from his rear, issues orders for a joint assault upon the Federal XII Corps. With Hooker remaining docile at the Bullock House, Lee sends Anderson to link up with McLaws and together press Sedgwick from the west. Meanwhile, Early, who has uprooted the Federals from Fredericksburg, is to press Sedgwick from the east. While these units look to envelop Sedgwick, Lee leaves Stuart to keep Hooker distracted. Given Hooker still outnumbers Stuart, the men of the II Corps order to keep a lively front to ensure the Federals do not have any second thoughts about attacking. After a few hours of maneuvering, Lee sends in his units to attack Sedgwick's lines at 5:30 p.m. Early lashes out and scores some relative success. McLaws shows little effort, and Anderson doesn't even attack at all. Without all the Confederate formations attacking, Lee is unable to score any major victory against Sedgwick's line. Once the light fades and the fighting dies down, Sedgwick realizes he is not safe where he is at and retreats north across the Rappahannock. When Hooker gets word of Sedgwick's withdrawal, he does something he hasn't done all campaign: call a council of war. That night, all the Corps commanders, including Butterfield, gather at his headquarters to discuss the future of the Army. Once Hooker lays out the situation in front of them, he polls them on whether they want to continue or end the campaign. To the surprise of Hooker, every single Corps commander votes to keep the campaign going. Even Howard, whose poor decisions put the Army in its current place. However, to the shock of all, Hooker, regardless of how the subordinates voted, decides to end the campaign and retreat. Starting after nightfall on Tuesday, May 5th, Hooker begins shuttling his army across the Rappahannock to the north bank. Throughout the night, the Army of the Potomac struggles across the river. Yet, at dawn on Wednesday, May 6th, rain starts to fall in droves, causing concern for the pontoon bridges that are to be used to evacuate the army. Luckily, the entire army is able to cross without much mishap. To Hooker, hemmed in at the Bullock House, Sedgwick retreating, and Longstreet rumored to be near, decides that retreating is the best option for the army, whether he lost confidence in himself, lost confidence in his plan, or was in a bad fix. Hooker opts for the campaign that promised to be the one to take Richmond to come to an end. Stoneman, who was sent out in the hopes to wreak havoc in the Confederate rear, failed to do any real damage or even prevent supplies from being shipped along the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. For the entirety of the campaign, even during the few days of intense fighting, the Confederates continued to use the line despite Stoneman's roving cavalry force. When Hooker gets word of how lackluster the raid was, he relieves Stoneman the second he returns from his ride and replaces him with McClellan's former chief of cavalry, Major General Alfred Pleasanton. Lee, wanting to do as much damage as possible, gets his men ready to attack the Federal lines. But just as he's about to issue the orders, he receives disheartening news that the Federals have retreated across the Rappahannock. In response, an infuriated Lee snaps, "This is a way that you young men are always doing. You have again let these people get away. I can only tell you what to do, and if you do not do it, it will not be done." To Lee, he will only get so many chances to destroy the enemy in detail, and when his subordinates fail to do their job, the consequences can and will come back to bite them. With the final Federal soldiers crossing over the Rappahannock River, Hooker's much anticipated 10-day-long campaign comes to a close. Out of those 10 days, at least 4 of them were full of horrifying combat that saw thousands of men fall on both sides. For the Army of the Potomac, Chancellorsville would be one of its bloodiest battles to date, losing 17,304 men killed, wounded, and missing. Surprisingly, only 13% of the army. Only McClellan's losses at Antietam would eclipse this number by a mere 282 men. On the other hand, the Army in Northern Virginia paid a heavy toll for winning the battle. Lee has lost 13,460 men killed, wounded, and missing, a staggering 22% of those who were engaged. Every man in Lee's army saw combat during the battle, just like at the Battle of Antietam last year. Hooker hoped to encircle and defeat Lee's army at Fredericksburg, yet by the time the battle finished, it was he who was sent running. Despite having more than double the number of men, Hooker miserably failed at using his numerical superiority to win. Though the average soldier wasn't as demoralized as they were after Fredericksburg, they felt like their generals failed to use them effectively. The Northern soldiers fought well and gave as much as they got, but what they couldn't count on was their generals leading them to victory. The only ones who saw any sort of blame for the loss were the Germans of Howard's 11th Corps, who were branded as the Flying Dutchmen for running after being flanked by Stonewall Jackson. Hooker, for being the general in command, is understandably the main culprit for the loss. He was too timid while facing smaller numbers, allowed Lee to control the battlefield, and didn't relinquish command when injured. Meade, writing to his wife, simply put, "General Hooker has disappointed all his friends by failing to show his fighting qualities at the pinch." Though the ultimate blame can be placed on the commanding general, many corps commanders failed to do their part in the battle, mainly Howard, Sedgwick, and Stoneman. Howard failed to protect the army's flank and was routed. Sedgwick failed to attack when he held all the advantages, and Stoneman failed to render Lee's position at Fredericksburg untenable. All the while, the nation was mortified to learn of another defeat along the Rappahannock. Lincoln, shocked after reading the news, mutters, "What will the country say? Oh, what will the country say?" Though Lincoln was surprised by the loss, he believed that the defeat was more due to unfortunate luck on their side. Meanwhile, a more shocked Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune wrote, "My God, it is horrible, horrible, and to think of it. 130,000 magnificent soldiers so cut to pieces by less than 60,000 half-starved ragamuffins." At least there are some who saw any benefit in the fight. New York diarist George Templeton Strong wrote that, though the Union was defeated, the rebels likewise undergone a fearful clawing. Across the Rappahannock, the Confederates under Lee are jubilant. After facing down an enemy twice their size, they were able to come away victorious. Unlike his opponent, Lee handled the battle expertly. He boldly split his small force to bring the battle to his terms. He sent Jackson on the audacious flank attack and kept the pressure up while facing imposing odds. After receiving news of the battle, the Richmond Sentinel declares, "It is now certain that the late victories near Fredericksburg were the most decisive of the war. General Lee himself has so declared." Though there was a lot of skill involved in handling the battle, aiding the Confederates was considerable good luck. First, Hooker decided to defend Chancellorsville, which put him on the defensive. Second, Jackson's bold flank attack went off without a hitch despite being seen multiple times. Third, the Federal capture of Fredericksburg, which took Lee's attention away from attacking Hooker on his Bullock House line. And finally, fourth, Hooker ultimately decided to quit the campaign while still outnumbering his foe. All these unexpected events helped give Lee one of, if not the greatest, victories in his career so far. Regardless of all this good luck, the battle had a sobering effect on the Confederate Army. 1/5 of those engaged were struck down, including dozens of officers, a toll the South could ill afford. This especially hits hard given that there was little tangible evidence to show for all the bloodshed. Lee sadly wrote, "At Chancellorsville we gained another victory. Our people were wild with delight. I, on the contrary, was more depressed than after Fredericksburg. Our loss was severe, and again we had gained not an inch of ground, and the enemy could not be pursued." However, the most devastating casualty of the battle was the Confederacy's favorite son, Stonewall Jackson. While the battle wound down, Jackson recuperated at the Wilderness Tavern. Following his wounding, his surgeon, Dr. Hunter McGuire, deems it necessary to have his left arm amputated. Once the battle moved on, he was transported to the safer location of Guinea Station to Hill. For the first few days after the wounding, from May 3rd to May 6th, Stonewall showed signs of recovery. But on May 7th, disastrous news strikes. The general is diagnosed with pneumonia. Dr. McGuire, along with others, try whatever remedy possible to treat the infection. The next day, Jackson shows signs of improvement and declares, "I believe God has yet a work for me to perform." But soon, the general drifts back into his feebled state. When Lee learns of Jackson's worsening condition, he tells Reverend Lacey to give Jackson his affectionate regards and say to him, "He has lost his left arm, but I my right arm." Anna, his wife, is called up from Richmond to console him, but when she sees her husband, she weeps, forcing the sick general to console her instead. In one lucid episode, Jackson tells Dr. McGuire, "I see, doctor, from the number of physicians you think my condition dangerous, but I thank God. If it is His will, then I'm ready to go." 2 days later, on Sunday, May 10th, 1863, Dr. McGuire realizes that Jackson does not have long and informs Anna. Anna tells her husband the somber news, and he responds by asking if it's true. The doctor confirms, and Jax responds by saying, very good, it is all right." Julia, Jackson's young daughter, is brought to him to say goodbye. A few hours later, at 2:30 p.m., a delirious Jackson shouts for all to hear, "Order A.P. Hill to prepare for action. Pass the infantry to the front. Tell Major Hawks." Then the general goes silent. About 45 minutes later, at 3:15, Jackson again speaks. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." After uttering those words, 39-year-old Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, the man who stood like a Stonewall at First Manassas, ran loose in the Shenandoah Valley, defended the railroad embankment at Second Manassas, captured Harper's Ferry, fought to a standstill at Antietam, riddled Burnside's ranks at Fredericksburg, and outflanked Hooker at Chancellorsville, dies peacefully in his bed.